Okay, folks, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We may have a few more people joining us. And for those of you who I've not met, and I think I know most of the people are probably on the call, my name is John Elcesser. I'm Executive Director here at INPEA. And I'd like to welcome you and thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit about this new emergency relief package that Congress passed and the President signed back on December 27th. Also want to give a shout out to Daryl Hagan, who's helping me with this presentation today. Most of you, or many of you, know Dr. Hagan, who's the superintendent for the Diocese of Evansville, and he's also the president of the INPEA board. So Daryl, appreciate your help, and he may chime in here periodically as well. Hopefully today I'm coming bearing good news. That's my intent anyhow, or I hope you, once we finish, you think it's good news. I've been working very closely over the last month with our department ed on the rollout of this new emergency relief package. I think there's probably only one organization that's better than educators at acronyms, and I think that's the federal government. Federal government has more acronyms, I think, than we've ever dreamed of here in education. And the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act is also known as CRRSA. And we'll kind of get into the details of that here in just a minute. I think by now everybody's a Zoom pro, but just in case we have everybody's microphones muted, we'd encourage you to keep them muted just to cut down on any kind of background noise we might have. We do encourage you to use the chat function if you have questions, and Daryl's going to help me monitor that and insert those questions, and we'll try to address as many as we can, and hopefully we'll have answers to some of them as well. But let me kind of begin, if I could. If I can get my slides to advance, we'll be in good shape here. Let's begin with a disclaimer. We don't have all the details yet, folks, and I didn't want to wait any longer to kind of make sure this was on everybody's radar. So we don't have the details. I'm going to try to answer questions or hopefully preemptively provide information that will answer some of your questions, but I may not have all the answers. And the good news is that we've had a great working relationship with the department and the State Board of Ed on this new package, and we will be planning a much more comprehensive webinar as well in terms of actually how you do engage with the program. So with that said, let's kind of start to get into the information. And the first thing that I want to do is I want to compare a little bit so you have some context between the CRRSA Act, which is the one we'll be talking about. This is the second emergency relief package that they passed, and the CARES Act, which we dealt with last early summer. So just some points of clarification. As I alluded to earlier, the CRRSA was signed into law by President Trump on December 27th. And unlike the CARES Act, there is no equitable service provision in this round of ESSER funds. So as you know, last time we could apply for a GEAR fund grant, or we could apply for ESSER funds or participate with ESSER funds. The ESSER funds, there was a mess in terms of how the allocations were calculated. And we really tried both at the federal level with this legislation and in particular here in the state of Indiana to try to make this a little bit more friendly to our non-public schools than what the CARES Act ended up being across the board. This particular program set aside money specifically for non-public schools in what some people call GEAR 2.0, or the U.S. Department of Education is referring to it as EANS, the Emergency Assistance for Non-Public Schools. And that's what we're going to spend time talking about. But also within that CCRSA Act was a revised PPP loan process as well, and want to spend some time kind of showing you a little bit about both of those, at least what we know at this particular point. With GEARS 1.0, it was a competitive grant that schools could opt to apply for. But with EANS, it won't be a competitive grant. It's going to be, the funds will be based on a formula. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. I struggled with a competitive grant because, good grant writers, probably would fare better. But we have some schools who were impacted by COVID that may not have those capabilities on staff. And, I think in some respects they lost out. Unlike ESSER, schools will not be working through their LEAs for these EANS funds. They'll be working through a single fiscal agent, and that was at our request, because LEAs do things very differently, and so there's a lack of consistency across LEAs. But the Southern Indiana Education Center, who did some work with Gears 1, has agreed to be the fiscal agent for the ESSER funds and the EANS funds, and we'll talk more about that here in just a minute. A key part of this new emergency relief package is that schools cannot, as they did last time, they cannot apply and receive awards from both of these funds. So you can't do PPP and EANS. Now, a point of clarification, the law says apply and receive. And because we don't know how the timing is going to play out between the two application processes, one for PPP, one for EANS, you technically can apply for both, but if you end up receiving both, you'd have to turn one down. You can only receive from one. And in the EANS application, it will say, are you receiving a PPP grant? Problem may be depending on the timing of all of this. Now, schools have to decide which of these that they're going to choose to participate in. If you really look at the programs, they're really fundamentally different. And you need to determine what meets the current needs of your school and your students. The PPP is focused more on operational fixed costs, payroll, rent, utilities. And it's intended primarily, although people, didn't use it necessarily for that, but to keep the school open and keep people employed. Now, on the EANS side, it leans much more in terms of instruction and what's happening in the building. And it's focused more on providing a quality instruction in a safe environment during and following the pandemic. Now, as schools look at decisions, they may, in addition to looking what's the best fit for them, they also may want to have a sense of where they're going to generate more dollars for their school. And it's pretty easy to calculate with the PPP. It's 2.5 times your monthly payroll cost. And you have to remember with a PPP, it's a loan with the hope that it's going to be forgiven. But forgiveness is not guaranteed, but I think everyone's hopeful and anticipating that it will be, and you may have already had your PPP1 already forgiven, but always want to emphasize that it is a loan. Now the EANS it's a formula grant, so there is no repayment of those, but there's some specifics with that we'll get into as well. And we're anticipating that the allocations for the EANS funds, because it's formulaic, will be released relatively soon. I know that they're working on that as we speak. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at the PPP 2.0. And some of this kind of flows from the last rendition of PPP as well. But who's eligible? Any small business, and I think most of our schools will fit under this. Any small business that employ 300 or less employees if you applied for PPP1, or 500 employees if you're a first-time applicant. That probably only applies if a diocese may look at doing it collectively rather than through as an individual school. I don't think any of our schools have a staffing of 300 people. And the other key factor that's different this time is that applicants must be able to demonstrate a 25% loss in gross revenues comparing one quarter from this year to that same quarter in the last fiscal year. I think the feds believed that some folks took advantage of it and really weren't necessarily, finances weren't significantly impacted by COVID. And so they put in a criteria. And this is the one that I'm hearing most from schools that may be an obstacle. I think a lot of our schools took a loss, whether they can document that it's a 25% loss, may be a challenge. And the other part is that if you were a recipient in PPP-1, you have to have used that loan amount or will use that loan amount in full to be eligible for the PPP-2 loan.
John,
one thing, go ahead.
John, let me jump in there.
Yep.
If applying for the first time, they did not apply the first time for PPP, so now they're applying now for the first time, does the 25% loss in gross revenue still apply if it's your first time?
Yes. The 25% loss is across the board. The only difference is, that I know, is the size of the employees, how many employees you can have, and using the amount in full. Any other questions, Daryl, while we're stopped? Okay, let's keep going. And this one's significant, that if you participate in PPP, you are a direct recipient of federal dollars. And anybody in non-pub should be aware that as a direct recipient of federal dollars, there are potential federal ties to that, especially as it relates to federal discrimination law. Now, there was some language in PPP-1 that provided some protective language for religious-based entities. And the other thing that's important to realize, and I think a lot of our schools, this was a key factor in applying the last time for PPP-1, was that your direct recipient status only applies for a limited time period until the loan's repaid or it's forgiven. Although I do have to tell you that I received information, got an article that there were a couple Catholic schools that were sued during their PPP loan period in California on a discrimination lawsuit that dealt with special education. So even though there were some religious protections, it didn't necessarily protect around all kind of discrimination issues. So something to keep in mind as you're trying to determine which of these makes most sense for your school. You know, if you look at total allocation, that CC or the CRRSA, the $900 billion was allocated. $284 billion was allocated for PPP, $82 billion for education, that's higher ed as well, and $2.75 billion specifically for EANS. That's a lot of money, and we'll talk about what that looks like here in Indiana as well. Just a couple other things on the PPP loan. It's pretty similar to PPP-1. Uses or payroll, including benefits, rents, utilities, covered mortgage interest, PPPE, which I think was added this time. And there are some limited operating costs that are allowable, but please note you have to spend 60% of those funds on specifically on payroll. The intent is to keep people from being laid off or losing their job with the whole PPP program. And so they want the majority of the money going towards payroll. And like PPP-1, you apply through a local bank or lender. It's not anything you do through Department of Ed or anyone here locally. So that's kind of the skinny, so to speak, on PPP 2.0. Any questions, Daryl, or anything from chat on that before I switch now over to EANS?
No, we're good.
All right, let's move on then. Let's take a look at EANS, the Emergency Assistance for Non-Public Schools. You know, last time there was this constant tug of war and battle of public schools saying we were taking their money and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And that's why they were pushing back on who had to be poverty related. Well, that's why this time they put it in a set aside specifically for non-public schools. And to be eligible to participate, you have to be an accredited school. And you have to submit an application and any required data like poverty data that's needed if they don't already have that for you. The uses, there are 12 defined in the law. I combined some here just to fit it on a slide, I guess. But, you know, I think key is being able to address learning loss. And we don't know and not sure, you know, how this COVID and switching back and forth between virtual has impacted you know, our students' learning. So you can address learning loss, educational technology, you know, purchase of equipment, those kind of things, addressing social emotional needs, PPE, anything dealing with school sanitation or disinfecting, and any associated training in that area. School ventilation, that's a lot of things that would come out around COVID, is that we need better ventilation systems to move air around. And all of these categories are not real specifically defined in the law. They're relatively broad. And so there's going to be questions about what's allowable and what's not. Because under ventilation systems, there's a allowable expense for a portable air purification system, but it has to be portable. There's also some mention of windows, but we're not totally clear on what that means. Is it to make sure windows could open so there's ventilation, or whether windows can be replaced? Those kind of things aren't spelled out very clearly. And as they rise up, or people, come up with ideas, we're going to have to address those individually with the department or with the fiscal agent. You're allowed to lease space if it's helping you to add more social distancing, or you're allowed to purchase physical barriers if that helps in terms of your safety protocols. The law also defines something around some reasonable transportation costs. And I don't know if that's like transporting kids to a tutor or doing things like that. That's not defined. It just says reasonable transportation costs. I'm not sure exactly what that means. And some costs, and this is a key one, and we'll get into a little bit more of it here in a second, can be reimbursable. And let me kind of go to the next slide on this, because this one gets a little bit complicated. Daryl?
John, I think I answered this question. You do have to be a state accredited school in order to receive EANS. No?
Not state accredited. You have to be accredited.
So Lisa, what I typed in the chat box, as the Diocese of Evansville will tell you, I'm wrong more than I'm right. So John, please address that and say it 3 times so that no one will listen.
You have to be accredited, and I'm not sure how near. I'm thinking they're probably going to interpret that broadly. Minimally, it's state accredited or accredited by one of the 8 state board approved crediting bodies, which would be ACSI, CSI, ISACs, Cognia, any of those that are on that approved list that allow you to get vouchers. So state accredited, and state accredited used to mean freeway or traditional. Now that's combined into one accreditation model. So it's state accredited or one of the other 8. I'm wondering, and I know we have a couple INPEA members that are accredited by another entity that's trying to get approved, and we'll have to look at those individually. I would push that if you're accredited, then I would say you'd have a pretty good chance in being eligible.
I'm sure that I shouldn't say that. Will the PowerPoint, I know we're recording this, will people be able to access the PowerPoint on the INPEA maybe website, or how would they access
Typically this? What Heidi does, and Heidi is not here this afternoon. Daryl is Heidi's still in. He's Heidi's understudy.
I am not worthy.
But typically Heidi will send out the PowerPoint to everybody who's registered.
Okay.
So
we'll get Heidi to do that tomorrow. Do all of the purchases have to happen after getting approved for EANS, or can we use these funds to pay for expenses we have already incurred? I think you're about to address that one.
I am. Great segue, Dr. Hagan. Thank you very much. You go to the next slide, we're going to talk about reimbursements. And reimbursements are allowable back to March 13th, 2020. So that's the first day of the pandemic. But there's a caveat. There are, within those 12 allowable expenses that you can use going forward, some of them are not allowed to be reimbursed. And that includes ventilation systems, staff training on health and safety protocols, addressing learning loss, and anything already reimbursed through PPP1. So those are not allowed to be reimbursed. Any other expenses in that allowable 12 list that I showed just a minute ago can be reimbursed if you have the appropriate documentation. We'll talk about that, and I have that right there. And the other thing that's critical, because I had a question, really astute question came from someone just yesterday or the day before, that does this make them a direct recipient of federal dollars if they take a reimbursement, because they're going to get a check from the fiscal agent. And according to the guidance from the U.S. Department of Education, it does not, because basically they would have paid for that item if you would have bought it in advance, and you're not making any money. It's a direct wash, so you're not yielding anything. It's just paying for it after the fact rather than before the fact. So it does not make you a direct recipient of federal dollars.
John, can a school employee resource personnel help students who are behind?
No. Your employees cannot be paid through this program. You can contract, and I'll get into that in a second, you can contract with a third party, and unless that maybe third party hires your people, that may be a possibility. Never can they be reimbursed for time that they're on your clock, because that's double dipping. But sometimes on Title I kind of programs, they will be able to pay for your folks if they are an employee of the LEA, but it has to be after hours, not when they're on the clock.
And somebody asked well, the specifics. Where can you find them? And Matt shared a link on the chat box directly to it. And AD says the federal FAQ just says that the school is accredited, licensed, or otherwise operates accordance with state law. So if Indiana excludes non-accredited schools, we may want to point them to the FAQ and bill language. Sorry for the typos, he said.
Well, I mean, the FAQ does say accredited, but the state, whether they can be more restrictive and say just state accredited and state board approved is, I think they're giving the state a lot of leeway in terms of how they implement it. I think the state's going to be more flexible, because in my conversations, they've had a very flexible tone to the conversation in terms of what's allowable and how we approach it. So if there's somebody accredited by an entity that's not on the approved list, reach out to me and we'll have that conversation. And I'm assuming that that they will probably permit that.
So if Joseph wants to know, if he had bought hand sanitizer or PPE over the past 10 months, are those reimbursable?
Yes, to my knowledge, they are, yes. It's not on the list. It's on the specific list. It's not reimbursable.
Okay.
So folks, big bucks, this is big. $81 million just for Indiana non-public schools in the EANS program. $81 million. It's huge. And we're going to talk about that as we go forward in terms of making sure we utilize the funds and what do we need to do to get ready to participate if that's the case. It will be based on a formula. And as you remember last time, because it was based on poverty, we had schools who weren't able to participate in the program because either they were a high school and their LEA did not serve high schools, or they didn't have much of a poverty count. And so they weren't, or their LEA didn't serve Title I schools in their area. So there were a lot of reasons why some schools did not benefit or not benefit very much. So we wanted to make sure that this was based on enrollment. And because the law says priority has to be given to poverty, we suggested adding a weighting for poverty. So for example, and don't go by these numbers, but as an example, your school could be allocated $800 per student. And depending on the number of students you have in poverty, and we'll talk about that in a second, it'd be additional $700 for each student in poverty. So for a student in poverty, you're gonna get $1,500, $800 for those that aren't in poverty. That's gonna add up to some significant bucks depending on your size. And the way the state has defined it, and the feds allowed the state define poverty, they're using 185% or below the poverty level as poverty. And an easy way to do that is to look at if you have free and reduced lunch counts, that would count, or anybody on a 90% voucher would count. If you don't participate in either of those programs, federal hot lunch or school choice program, then you can use survey data to determine that. The state, the last I checked, had poverty numbers for every school except 20. And Andrew Mazur sent out a follow-up email a couple of days ago to try to collect that data from the additional 20 schools. And so if you're one of those schools, I'd encourage you to respond as soon as possible. So just some more things about EANS. The law, like in a title program, requires public control of funds. That means we don't get dollars in hand. Never get them for Title I, never get them for Title II, Title III, Title IV. The public agency has to maintain control of those funds. And rather than dealing with whatever it is, 90 some different LEAs, we proposed that we worked with a single fiscal agent so there'd be consistency across the state. And the Southern Indiana Education Center, who helped work with some of our schools with GEAR grants in GEAR 1.0, has agreed to serve as the fiscal agent for this $81 million program. There is a possibility in talking to DOE that they may be using a third party to help process all the requisitions, because you would assume $80 million and X number of schools, there's going to be a lot of requisition stuff going on. And so there may be a third party, and there may be even some training about how you submit requisitions to that third party for purchases. Like title funding, anything purchased through EANS remains in the ownership of the fiscal agent. You know, anybody who's had Title I stuff and you bought equipment, you have to put a little sticker on it and says who owns it. They never ask for it back or anything like that, you know, but they technically retain ownership. The way the law reads, that funds have to be obligated within 6 months after allocation. There's some question, and the FAQ that the department put out addresses it in part, but there's some question still about defining obligation. If you sign a contract with a third party that's going to do after school tutoring for a year, when you sign the contract, that money's obligated. It's not when that's different than being expended. There is some question as to once the state allocates the money to the fiscal agent, whether it's obligated, or whether once the state provides the allocation to the individual schools, whether that's obligated. I think that's a pretty loose definition, but I'm not making those decisions. And so there still needs to be some clarification, but that 6 months starts a clock to a certain extent. And we're going to talk at the end about how crucial it is for you right now to start planning if you think you're going to participate in this program. Because if you're a relatively large size school, you're going to get a significant amount of money that you're going to need to come up with a plan of how best to serve your kids and to address any impact of COVID. The thing is, it has to be obligated in 6 months, but it doesn't have to be expended till September 2023. That's a long time out. So you could plan 2 or 3 summer programs, you know, that you're going to do to address learning loss, or you can do, you know, a number of things. So you have to have a plan. It has to be obligated, but it doesn't have to be expended till September 2023. Daryl, do you have another question?
Yes. How does reimbursement for past expenses, the PPP and the sanitizer previously purchased, how does that work with the issue of public control of funds?
Well, and that's what I alluded to earlier, that because it's a reimbursement for something purchased, the school is not yielding any money. They're not making any money on this. And it's no different, except from a timing perspective, if they would have bought it for you next week versus they're paying for it because you bought it 2 months ago. So it's still the same thing. The money's not going to the school. It's going to pay for the whatever the item is that's an allowable expense. And that specifically is addressed in the guidance in the FAQ from the U.S. Department of Education.
Thank you.
If schools want to, and this was alluded to in an earlier question, schools want to use funds to provide services like tutoring, summer schools, you know, additional an aid or something, they cannot pay their staff through this program. And they can, but they can hire a third-party provider, like a Catapult or like a Fax, or the different ones that are providing those kind of services already here in the state. And they can contract with them. What would happen is that the fiscal agent, the Southern Indiana Education Center, would contract with one of those third parties to provide X hours or X number of services to your school. Some third-party providers will hire your staff to do things after hours or summer school. I don't know how that plays into the program. I know we cannot pay the school to pay them directly. We can't pay an individual directly because there's some tax issues with that. We've got into trouble with that with Title I in the past. That's why they have to be an employee, even though they're your teacher, they have to be an employee of the LEA if they're getting any kind of funding for providing Title I services after hours.
John, if more schools apply for the PPP2, non-public schools, does that mean the EANS pot is larger for the other schools?
That would be my assumption. Very good question. And I've asked that because some schools may not even apply for PPP, but some schools just don't do state and federal funding, and they may not take this. And the allocations basically have every accredited school, in the formula. So my assumption would be that if schools opt not to participate either because they're going to do PPP or they just don't want to do federal program, then that money would then be allocated and spread across the schools. And we'll clarify that, how that's going to happen. And we may know that at the beginning before if people submit their application and they don't get applications, they can then, there'll be a deadline in terms of, by law, they were required 30 days, a minimum of 30 days. But I think we're going to want folks to try to apply once the applications are released from the department as quickly as possible. And we'll talk about the application here in a second as well. As I alluded to earlier, some folks are going to get a pretty hefty chunk of change, which is awesome. Like I said, I come bearing good news. $81 million just to our non-public schools in Indiana is huge. Planning is critical. When you leave this meeting tomorrow, you need to get your leadership teams together and say, okay, folks, we're going to have a pretty significant amount of money. How are we going to get the best use of these funds? What do we need to be planning to do that? So start looking at the allowable uses and how that matches with the particular needs that your school have and what's going to be the greatest benefit to your kids. Think short term because it's going to happen pretty quickly. But again, you don't have to expend it till 2023. So you may be talking about a couple different summer programs to address learning loss. Once you determine how you think you want to best spend your allocations, and I know you can't do that any great extent until you have actual figures, but hopefully you'll have that relatively soon. Then start to develop a budget. What's this going to cost? And any way you can kind of if you have a vendor or a third-party provider, you can recommend that they apply to participate in this program. There'll be a portal for those vendors to become a vendor in this program. If you're looking at possibly getting reimbursed for allowable expenses back in March, start getting your documentation together now, because you're going to have that. And bottom line is that unused funds would revert back to the governor. So anything that's not obligated in 6 months, it goes back to the governor in the GEARS fund. Now the governor has options. He can reallocate it in all of his GEARS stuff that he's going to use his other money for. He can reallocate it across non-public schools. We haven't had that conversation yet. So, if you get an allocation of $500,000 and you're not going to be able to use all that and obligate that, that's going to go back into the kitty initially to the governor to determine within his purview where he wants to reallocate those funds. And I've been assured by the department, the application process for this is going to be really simple. I asked for a simple petition. What I did when this was released, I went to the Department of Ed with 5 bullets and said, here's what I'd like to see in the program. They agreed to every one of the bullets. Little tweaks here and there, but basically agreed to every one of the bullets. And they were all based on all the frustrations we had with the last emergency relief program. But there's probably going to be as little as 3 or 4 questions, all of it based in the law. Did you receive, are you going to receive a PPP2 fund? What's your poverty count? How are you going to use these funds, and what do you see the cost being? And then probably a few assurances you have to sign. Application is going to be simple. Now, I had a conversation with the DOE, email conversation earlier today. The law and the guidance allows for schools to apply collectively, like a diocese to apply. I would contend that that's going to be as simple as the individual application process is, and realizing even across the diocese, the uses may be very, very different and varied. I think it's going to be very complicated to try to do one application for a group of schools like a diocese. Now, if that's something that somebody's really committed to, let's have that conversation. But with a simple application process, it's not going to be burdensome to a school. And because people's needs and where they're going to focus may be different, I'm not sure I see a huge benefit. But again, if you do, let's have that conversation.
Okay.
So,
John, 3 questions. We have a third-party janitorial service that are not their own employees. Can we pay them for enhanced cleaning?
Yes.
Well,
you can't pay them. They'd have to be paid through the fiscal agent. So they'd have to be a vendor, apply to be a vendor, and they'd have to contract with the fiscal agent. You can't pay them.
Okay.
Now, yeah, and that's not one of the reimbursable expenses to go backwards.
Okay. Do the EAN funds focus more on future purchases compared to the PPP, which focuses a lot on past purchases and expenses? Is that what you would say?
No, the PPP is not really focused on past, at least unless I'm missing something. You in the old PPP, you applied 2.5 times your monthly payroll, and you had an 8-week period to expend that. Now, somewhere within the program, they ended up changing that to allow up to 24 weeks. So my understanding, unless I'm missing something with PPP, it's paying forward. And what they did with this version of PPP is, because of the change they did in PPP 1, you can select an 8-week coverage period up to a 24-week coverage period. So you can pick anywhere in between that. And that's where you would expend the money, that you get through the PPP.
Okay.
EANS is both ways. It's encouraging you to look forward up to 2023, but also you're allowed to get some of those costs reimbursed if you would choose to do that.
And the final question, is there any early guidance on what constitutes educational technology?
No, the line says educational technology. and folks, there's some really good things about being nebulous, because that gives us a lot of room to navigate. So, I think, whether it's now, and realizing anything you purchase equipment wise, they own. Whether they would ever take it back, I doubt it, but they own. So kind of keep that in mind. But there is nothing, because they're trying to encourage support for remote instruction, virtual instruction, pandemic related. So anything that would enable that, I think, would be allowable. And I get the impression that the State Department here is going to be pretty flexible.
If we are a school with 2 state numbers, do we break out our expenses and poverty count over both schools, or do we combine our schools together? That is Steve Wild asking that question.
Steve Wild always asks good questions up at Blackhawk Christian. Steve, that's a good question. I'll have to get back to you on that, because we do have schools with multiple, up to 3 school numbers. And, if you're separate facilities, you may want to do separate. I don't know the answer to that. I'll have to check that out and get back to folks on that.
You mentioned that you might be a recipient of federal funds during the PPP loan period. If we are approved for equipment purchase, does that make us a direct recipient during the life of the equipment?
Equipment through PPP or EANS?
They'd probably say both. I don't know.
Because I don't know what kind of equipment they would purchase through PPP. There might be something, but very limited. If you're speaking EANS, no, you are not a direct recipient.
Okay.
Because you don't own it. The state does.
When will we know the exact amount per student and per student in poverty that we will be getting?
The allocations, they are working on those. I would hope within the next week or so, we will see the allocations and the application probably coming, not too far around that time. That would be my hope. That it will be happening in the next couple of weeks. And like I said, it's hard to do a lot of planning, but if you're a larger school, we're going to see ballpark. My guess, really tiny school. And one of the things that they told me, tiny schools, they're going to give them a minimum of $10,000, no matter whether because we have some really, really small schools. So they kind of did a base amount of $10,000, and that's going to go up to over $1 million is my guess, depending on the size of the school.
If you do purchase technology, would we, the school, be able to service the equipment, or do we have to go through the fiscal agent to service equipment purchased?
Another good question. My assumption is that you will be able to service it. I know at times, like with Title I and IPS or Title II, you've had to rely sometimes you're waiting for weeks and weeks and weeks for them to come service something. I don't think this single fiscal agent is going to do any kind of servicing, so I assume you're going to be able to service it on your own.
Okay. Our preschool received PPP money for our preschool staff through our associated church. We did not have to be accredited to get that loan. Can we apply for a second PPP loan, or do we have to be accredited for the second PPP loan for the school alone? Yeah,
PPP does not require accreditation because it's open to any small business. You're not coming into it technically as a school, you're coming into it as a small business. So accreditation does not apply on the PPP side.
Thank you. We're caught up.
All right, so you got some work to do, and I can't emphasize enough that it's critical that you start really digging in, meeting with because like I said, if you're going to be $500,000. I mean, if you're a decent sized school, and even our smaller schools, they're going to, which is money you're not used to having, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000. It's going to be significant dollars. And if you don't use it, and I don't want to get into a public school, and this is terrible to say, a public school mentality where they spend money for the sake of spending money. But, I'm sure all of our schools have significant needs. And one of the things I worry about is how our kids are going to fare coming out of the crazy instructional back and forth. And so learning loss is why I put it top of the list, because it's one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about. But there's lots of other kinds of uses. We will provide the PowerPoint for you, and I will also provide the link to the FAQ that the U.S. Department of Education put out, and they go through a multitude of questions and kind of helps you better understand the overall, and that's strictly for the EANS program. There's some guidance out there for PPP. I haven't seen an FAQ necessarily, but there are some different links. They have emergency rules that have already been released, but that gets into a lot of business acumen that I don't have. So I'm not by any means an expert in the PPP area. I look at it from the 40,000 foot level. But I really want to encourage folks to start planning, because this will happen and happen quickly. And we want to be ready and make sure we can maximize the use of these dollars.
John, one final question. Does the EANS that apply to K through 12 schools, could those funds also be used for preschool that's associated with the school?
My gut says technically no. Somebody needs to mute a microphone if you could. We have some background, sounds like little kids, which is great. Like to hear little kids. I don't get to hear little kids very often anymore. But if you're going to hear them, you get to get them on screen so we get to see them too. Technically, I would say no to the pre-K. But if that means you're purchasing sanitizing equipment and sanitizing stuff, I sure wasn't concerned about going in and doing it at the pre-K level. But if you're talking about buying Chromebooks for your PK, I think we probably would want to ask that question because this is pretty much intended for K to 12.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments, any other thing, Daryl?
Lorenza says
Yep.
projected timeline on knowing numbers and getting a list of acceptable reimbursements and acceptable expenses moving forward using the EANS. Any projected timeline on how, I guess it's 6 months.
Well, yeah, just what I said before, DOE is working feverishly. They're dealing with also the ESSER funds on top of this, and they've been working really hard. Andrew Mazer, our ombudsman's been involved. Cole Dietrich, who is the new Nathan Williamson, and Ron Sandlin, who was at the state board and now is moving over to the department, are the 3 point people there. I think we're going to have the allocations relatively soon. I don't know how quickly they'll release the application. They at least have to hear back from the feds that their application has been approved, which we know it will be. It's just a matter of them getting it in. There's a deadline, I think, of February 8th or something like that, that they have to have their application in. And the only other, I don't want to end on a downer, but we're sure hoping that the new administration doesn't do anything to damage this. And, especially when you talk about direct recipient of federal dollars and discrimination kind of stuff associated with PPP, where there was some protective language for religious entities, we're hoping they don't come in and try to mess that up. We're going to move forward as if they're not. Once we get the funds allocated, I think and that'll happen quickly. Once they send the application in, it's approved, they automatically bank transfer the money to the state, and the money will be available. Then the applications can go out, and the quicker we turn those around, the quicker funds will be available to the Educational Service Center for you to start requesting purchases.
John, just to wrap up, because I know we're getting close to our 1 hour, as board president, I just want to take this opportunity with 73 participants to thank John Elcesser. We are blessed in Indiana not only to have INPEA as a valued member of each one of our schools, but to have John Elcesser always be that voice for non-public students, staff, teachers, administrators. The board works very hard, but no one works harder for INPEA and non-pubs than John Elcesser. And we are grateful, John, for your leadership each and every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl. I appreciate that. You can fill in for Heidi anytime, huh, Daryl?
Oh, it was very stressful.
Hey, folks, good. Hopefully you see this as good news. I'm sure there's going to be lots more conversation. Watch for stuff coming from the department. We'll be doing another webinar with them that'll tell you exactly how to process applications, how to, look at the allocation, all that kind of stuff will be coming soon from them. But I wanted to get this on your radar as soon as I could so you could start planning and getting some ideas of how you would utilize your funds. I hope everybody's staying healthy and well during the craziness. I think we're hopefully seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. I've been really proud of how our non-public schools have really stepped up and continued to provide for our kids. And that's not just me, I'm hearing it from people around the state that non-pubs have really rallied during this time. And that's not necessarily true, of all schools. So thank you for what you do in your leadership positions. Always remember that INPEA is here if we can serve you and help you. If anybody's not signed up, we're doing another PD Thursday tomorrow on social emotional learning. We've got a speaker that's coming in being funded by FACTS. If you haven't signed up for that, we really think that's going to be a great opportunity. We're trying to provide these PD Thursdays at least once a month, so hopefully you can take advantage of that since we weren't able to do INPEC, although INPEC is scheduled for October next year, so we hope to see you there too. Thanks, folks. Have a good evening. Stay safe.
Bye, everybody.
Well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Daryl.
The State House Express has also just been released. Check it out. Thanks, John.